All right. Hello, everybody. Today, your coaches, Olivia and Sarah, will be talking about the September-October public forum topic. This is Able to Shine's first of hopefully many topic lectures designed to give you an in-depth background knowledge on the topic this year or this coming months. The expectation is to watch this video while taking notes, and you should feel free to pause anytime and write down any questions you might have to ask your coaches. But we really want you to use this video to help build and construct your constructive speeches for the topic. So first, we're going to go through some definitions of topics, then go over what high-speed rails look like in specific countries, and finally introduce common pro and con contentions. The topic reads that the United States federal government should substantially increase its investment in high-speed rails. The agent of the topic, so the person doing the action, is the United States federal government, which limits the topic to only United States federal government investments, but that doesn't necessarily make it a domestic topic, which Sarah will be talking more about, because advantages can be created about US investments and its implications for the world, and also have modeling arguments. I really like this topic because I think it speaks to a broad range of skill sets of debaters. By that, I mean that it's really an accessible topic for our novices to begin learning how to research, because there's a ton of literature on both sides of this topic. But it can also be a really advanced topic where link turns and round vision, or knowing how you're going to collapse the round down, really does matter. I envision that the pro and con will have similar arguments or similar impact areas, which we'll go over. So in this topic, a skill you really want to work on is things like cross applications, impact comparison, and even in some cases, collapsing the round down to just the pro or the con flow. Okay, Sarah?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. So let's start off with definitions just pulled from the topic itself. The first phrase I think we should look at is substantially increase. HSR, or high-speed rail, is going to require a very large investment on the front end from the federal government. Currently, the federal government is not investing a lot of money into this. It's mainly relying on local, city, and state governments to fund any potential projects, which means there's a lot of ground to make up for. The problem is, traditionally in speech and debate, we'd like to look at substantially increase as more of a over 50% increase or even 100% increase in funding. That will not be sufficient to fund projects for high-speed rail, unfortunately. So we should remember that when we're arguing points like topicality with the phrases substantially increase, unless there's a proposal to fully fund projects, the federal government is going to fall short in investment, and these trains and train lines will not manifest. The second word I want us to look at is the word investment itself. I want to be clear for our novices that this means the action or process of just investing money. It is the federal government putting money into these high-speed train projects to make sure that they manifest. Because as we'll be discussing later on, right now, America has no high-speed rails currently. On the subject of high-speed rails itself, the United States has two functional definitions for what a high-speed rail is. The United States Department of Transportation says that a rail service with speeds from 110 miles per hour to 150 miles per hour meets the criteria for a high-speed rail, but the United States Code says that it must reach speeds of more than 125 miles an hour. However, the Congressional Research Service says that all rail services with top speeds less than 150 are only higher speed rails. So this is going to be an interesting point of contention. How fast these train projects are going to go is probably going to determine whether or not they are high speed or higher speed. Maybe it's a point that some of our more advanced debaters would like to work out in debates, but it's good to know that there are a variety of definitions when it comes to high-speed trains, and different countries have different standards for what their high-speed train speeds are. So let's talk about trains. There's a lot of very industry specific terminology used when it comes to trains. The first phrase that you might, or word that you're going to hear a lot is corridor. A rail corridor is just where train tracks are. It is the strip of land that is used for the train line itself. A sealed corridor is a rail corridor that does not have any roads, bridges, highways intersecting it. So it is completely sealed off on its own. A lot of times, especially when we're traveling around, we see that train tracks will crisscross with other means of transportation in the United States. So there's a lot of railroad crossings where a road will intersect a railroad, and that is that is not a sealed corridor. That is an unsealed corridor. Another phrase you might come across is dedicated high-speed lines. This is a train line that is only meant for high-speed trains. This line is not shared with any other type of train. However, on the opposite end, a shared use track is a rail line that is used by both high-speed trains, passenger trains, and freight trains. The last train term I want us to talk about is maglev or magnetic levitation. This is a very specific type of high-speed rail. It is not on a train track as is traditionally used. It is specific technology using magnets, and there is a singular rail that the train floats atop of at very high speeds. And last, I think we should cover some general terminology that you'll come into contact with that didn't fit anywhere else. The first is right-of-way acquisition. This is a term that is almost like eminent domain. It is the taking of land or purchasing of land for use in the projects of building trains and train lines. Unfortunately, building rail lines necessitates that we purchase a lot of land from counties, from cities, from farmers, from homeowners, and right-of-way acquisition is one of the terms that you will hear when we're talking about that process. The other is the Belt and Road Initiative. This is specifically the project program from China that they use to go into other countries to build up infrastructure projects. This will make a lot more sense later when we talk about China and how they are expanding high-speed rail, but it's a really good thing to be familiar with if you're new to public forum. The Belt and Road Initiative was a topic a couple years back, but it has popped up in public forum topics ever since, so it's good to be familiar with this concept. And lastly, I think it's important to understand that when we are talking about high-speed trains, we are always going to be comparing the speeds of these trains to airline speeds. And so it's good to know that commercial airline speeds are on average between 550 and 600 miles per hour. And this is the speed point that trains are competing against and constantly trying to improve to match or even surpass.
Right, so on this topic, you want to be listening to it with two ultimate questions here, because your debate's gonna often boil down to one or two of these issues. So first, you have this question of environment, and the ultimate question is, will the trains reduce, the high-speed rails, reduce CO2 or produce more in the short term? So that'll be one question. The pro will say that it reduces CO2. The con will say that it actually produces more in the short term by building it, having to mine all the materials, etc. Second question here will be, what energy sources will be used to generate the electricity fueling these railroads? Oftentimes the high-speed rails are fueled by electricity, but remember, something has to be creating that electricity or powering it. In China, often they burn a lot of coal to fuel them. So, I mean, ultimately, is that really a cleaner form of energy? The second question here is the question of economy and balance. So first, will the upfront cost of the rail lead to economic growth via things like city development, job creation, tourism, or will it be a massive cost and throw the nation into debt, spike interest rates, etc.? So on the pro, what they have to do is win that the benefits of the rail or the rail gets used enough for its benefits to outweigh those kind of disadvantages and that massive cost of the rail. And the NEG wants to say that the massive cost of the rail will not be offset by how often it gets used. So those are kind of the two questions you want to have in the back of your mind while you're listening to this lecture.
Okay, let's talk about China. Now, China was not the originator of high-speed rail. In fact, they weren't even one of the early adopters of high-speed rail, but they have the most extensive rail network for a singular country. So it's really important to talk about them. Let's look at the timeline of China's high-speed rail. In the 1980s, they started planning construction and then actually proposed it officially to their government in the 90s. By 1997, we see an increase in speed of trains. And in 2007, China has a technological breakthrough that allows them to more quickly develop high-speed rails in their country. And in 2008, they approve a long-term plan for a giant network of trains that would connect the whole of China together. By 2011, they complete 8,358 kilometers of high-speed rail lines, which blows them past every other country in the world. 2013, they increased that to 10,463 kilometers. In 2017, 25,000 kilometers. And by 2025, China wants to double that to 50,000. And by 2035, reach 70,000 kilometers of rail. This is a big picture vision for the government of China. It is one of their goals to finally interconnect the whole of their country and even beyond that. And so we can see from 2008 to 2020, the train lines exploded. The image speaks for itself. It was a massive undertaking by the Chinese government to get this done, but it is created a form of transportation in their country that is more reliable than airline travel. It is quick, it is cheap, it is efficient, and it's widely used by the public. Next. So how does China accomplish this? Well, first, China has a very centralized government, and so they can top down quickly decide when and where and how to build these rails. And then also they can set prices low to help cut down on costs and to also make these lines affordable for their people. They also cost less for China to build because they have standardized building practices. And so they're not getting bids from different companies or having competing interests. The one goal is just to fund and build these rail lines. One of the ways they do fund the project, though, is through bonds that they sell to the people of China. It creates a sort of hidden debt for them, but it has allowed them to build this explosive network of rail lines without falling too far into debt. These trains, as I said, are very popular with the people, and the lines that connect to big cities are always busy and always heavily utilized. This has increased economic activity within China, and it has also decreased greenhouse emissions. These trains run off of electricity, and China has said that it has actually lowered their greenhouse emissions. They also long-term plan to expand more of these rail lines to increase tourism, but they also want to expand their lines into other countries. They want to go eastward, maybe into India, northward into Russia, southward. I believe that they would probably long-term like to connect to South Korea, Hong Kong, into the Philippines, probably even long term, that they really have a goal of bringing more people into China for tourism's sake. And also, as part of the Belt Road Initiative, they will have these countries allow them to come in to build these rail lines, and then these countries will have to pay back these building debts to China, probably at a higher price than what it cost them to build. So it would be a profitable endeavor for China. And as we've seen with other Belt Road Initiative projects in the past, if the country fails to pay back China, China will take control over these rail lines more than likely and use them as a source of revenue in the future. So it's part of their larger plan. China has a very big picture view of rail lines. It's interested in widespread usage, maybe a little less so than efficiency. It has as we'll talk about in the con point, not everything is perfect with the China high-speed rail system, but it is definitely the largest, most sprawling network of lines, and they are built the most quickly out of every other area that has high-speed rails. So as we kind of talked about hidden debt on the last slide, there is a lot of debt from building these rail lines. A single kilometer of rail line can cost China between 17 and $20 million. This has obviously accrued them quite the large bill. They need to buy land, resources, pay their workers. A lot of the rails for China's trains are actually suspended up on supports. They're up in the air. And so it's not just building tracks along the ground, it is building the support network and the bridges that support these rail lines. Also, most of these rail lines aren't actually profitable. It is only the rail lines that are in the most populous of cities that end up breaking even or turning a profit. Because remember, China keeps the train ticket prices low, so they'll be more utilized by their people. But that means that these rail lines don't make a profit. In some of the more rural areas of China where these rail lines are not heavily or regularly utilized, they turn a net loss every year, which means China cannot pay back the massive debt it has been amassing in building these rail lines. Now, China is willing to swallow that debt and offset it with other parts of their economy, but if another country attempted to do this, it would probably not be as successful in swallowing down that debt. China is a very specific case given its government structure and the way that their economy is really strong in a lot of other areas. They're able to balance this all out, but that won't be the case for every other country. Also, China has heavily neglected its other areas of transportation infrastructure because they put so much investment into these rail lines. One of the places they have really neglected is freight lines and freight rail systems. Now, this has a lot of implications. This means that they cannot as quickly move around massive amounts of supplies or products to other parts of the country. And so it relies on trucks, big 16-wheeler trucks to ship around supplies and goods and products. The problem with this is this offsets all of the carbon emission benefits that these high-speed rail lines would produce. So it's a give and take. We now have more trucks being driven in China to supply different parts of the country, and compared to what it used to be where there were more rail lines that would ship supplies. So there's definitely issues and concerns with that. The other issue and concern is safety. So China has built train lines that are in very windy areas, and the faster a train goes, the more likely it is to come off of the tracks with enough pressure. So a train moving very quickly gets hit by a gust of wind, it's very likely that that train might wobble on the tracks or even come off the tracks and cause a crash. Also, inefficiencies in the scheduling system has led to train crashes in China in the past, which has led to injuries and deaths. So The problem, I think, is China has grown so quickly and such a large scale that it was almost incapable of maintaining efficiency. And there was obviously going to be some kind of user error at some point in scheduling on the train lines, and that has led to some issues. China has done a much better job in recent years staying on top of these issues. And so there hasn't actually been a crash for a little bit, but it is definitely something that has happened in the past. And the effect of that crash and those crashes was less people were willing to use the train line because they thought that they were unsafe. So that caused those train lines to lose even more money because people didn't have faith in the safety of these train lines. It's like when there's a plane crash, less people get on and less people are willing to get on a plane. And then so let's move on to the European Union. So the European Union is starting to try to develop more of an interconnected system of rail lines. France kind of started the trend and led the way in the 80s. They have the most amount of track out of all of the EU countries with a whopping 2,800 kilometers. But a lot of different countries have quite a bit of track. Italy has a lot of track. Spain has a couple of high-speed rail lines, and basically the goal for the EU is to interconnect all of the major cities to help with tourism, to help with trade, economics. The European Union has a system of free movement between countries. If you are a citizen of one European Union country, you can move freely between the rest of them without need for passports or checkpoints or anything like that. It is a system that is really helpful to economic development and tourism, and the high-speed lines are a great contributor to that. The European Union as a governmental body also helps with funding a lot of these rail lines, and one of its stated goals for the last couple of decades has actually been to continue to develop these high-speed rail lines and connect them together. One of the consequences of this is it is less of a cohesive network like we see in China. There's less of a big picture network that is well thought out and well planned in advance, and more of a patchwork of interconnected national lines. So Spain will create its train line that makes sense for them, and France will make their train lines that make sense for them. And then at a certain point, they will sit down and they will argue out and they will agree how to connect their lines together. It's also mostly in the EU, they use a single standard of rail width, rail type, but Germany has also decided to forego that standard, and Germany actually has their own rail line standards. So there's not always agreement in what is best for the whole of the European Union. And like I said, this is a connection of national lines that are built to whatever standard that country sees fit. And then it is up to everyone to collectively together to kind of make sense in how to connect all of them. And a lot of times what's going on with these high-speed rail projects in the EU is that it is old train lines that are being retrofitted and upgraded as part of high-speed rail extensions. That means saving costs, but it also means that certain train lines will be down for these retrofittings. So it's a kind of a give and take project, but not everything they're making is brand new from scratch, which I think saves them money long term and is really actually beneficial to them. But there are definitely issues when it comes to the train systems in the European Union. The first is just the geography of the region. There are a lot of really intense mountainous regions in Europe, like the Swiss Alps, that create physical barriers between the largest cities in the area, which means there's only one option. You have to tunnel through the mountains in order to connect these cities together. These trains cannot go up and over. Most times it is not efficient to put them around, so you must go through, and it's actually the cheapest path of least resistance. But that makes these projects expensive, almost prohibitively so. They're in the upwards of multi-billions of dollars. It is much more expensive to build high-speed rails in Europe than it is in China. And one of the reasons is the topography. Um, Also, we must take into consideration that when we're building train lines across international borders, there's going to be a lot of fighting and a lot of arguing of who and when and how and with whose money and to what standard, which is going to heavily delay the process because every single part of it must be gone over, argued, agreed upon, negotiated on. Whereas with China, we see a much more streamlined process of build it, this is where you build it, you will build it, here's the money to build the project. Whereas with Europe, it is a much longer, much more heavily involved and much more political process. Where these train lines are built and what cities they connect has a make or break effect for a lot of these countries. They feel like sometimes their economic stake is on the line, and they could be really hurt if a train line doesn't connect them to the larger network, or they'll be the big winner and they will reap all the benefit of having that connection. And so there's a lot at stake for these countries, and a lot of them aren't willing to foot a really high bill unless they're getting something in return. Each country is fighting for its own benefit and for itself, and again, that will delay the process and cause issues long term. And finally, we have Japan. This is the birthplace of the high-speed rail line. They developed their first rail line in 1964. They call it the Shinkansen, or as Europeans or Western people might call it the bullet train, though Shinkansen does not mean bullet train. And they created their first line specifically to connect distant cities with the capital of Tokyo for the economic benefit. They started with just 320 miles of track in 1964 as their first line opened, but they now have 1,717 miles of completed track, and they're building more, as we'll discuss later on. Japan is seen as the gold standard for rail lines. If China has the biggest network and the fastest growing network, France has the fastest train in existence currently, and the European Union is the largest internationally connected network, Japan is just still seen as the ideal train network line. They are also one of the safest. They have never had a train crash, and that's even with their trains reaching speeds of 150 to 200 miles per hour. They have also run into issues with the debt in the past due to buying expensive land. This was early on in their train developing days, in like the 70s and 80s. They have since restructured the way that they do train building, but even Japan has had issues with money, and you'll see that this is a common theme. High-speed rail trains are extraordinarily expensive to build, almost prohibitively so. And so these countries, I hope that you all take away from this, have decided that this is an investment worth making, and that these three areas, the European Union, China, and Japan, have put quite a lot of their monetary resources into making these projects to move their people around. This is transportation infrastructure. It's necessary for their people, but also I want you all to recognize that in a lot of these cases, these three areas have in common that their countries are public transportation friendly. Their cities are walkable. Their cities have good other public transportation networks to support them, like good busing systems and good walkable cities that are easy to traverse. I'm sure Olivia will talk a little right now about how that is not the case for the United States. So Olivia, please tell us more. You're muted.
Okay. All right. So in the United States, we currently do not have a rail system that meets this definition of high-speed rail. So you might be familiar with Amtrak's Acela, which is a higher speed rail, and that connects DC and Boston, but doesn't meet that miles per hour standard originally set. So a little bit of history for this so that you have some context when I'm talking about this. The quest for kind of high-speed ground transportation began in the 60s, mid-60s, when Lyndon B. Jackson, the president, asked Congress to devise ways to increase speed on American railroads as part of his request for improving infrastructure. So Congress replied to this with the High-Speed Ground Transportation Act of 1965, which ultimately created a Metroliner service between New York City and Washington, D.C. Since then, there have been numerous acts like the Passenger Railroad Rebuilding Act in the 80s to fund and build high-speed corridors. The biggest kind of move towards that was in '93 when the US aimed to improve service between Boston and New York. And so they electrified the Northeast Corridor, which you'll see a lot of high-speed rails. That's the primary categorization of them, which enables them to move a lot faster. And they also replaced some of the Metroliners with this electrified rail. And so they had the new service in Acela, which linked Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and DC. So a lot of these contentions will be talking about the benefits of this rail. And you should note, though, that is not considered a high-speed rail, but they will note that its usefulness in American infrastructure. So if we fast forward a little bit, the Obama administration was the next big admin who pushed for higher speed or high-speed rails. And that was a result of things like higher jet fuel prices, congested airports and highways. And so the thought is that if we connected these cities, people could take the rail in replace of, these shorter flights or in replace of the highways. So what was next was building this California high-speed rail network. And that was set to connect Los Angeles to San Francisco. They have spent $5 billion over the past 14 years, which is how long they've been trying to build it. And they've yet to lay pretty much a single mile of track. And this is because prices have skyrocketed and we're now focusing. And so they decided to narrow their focus to just a stretch through the Central Valley. But part of the reason that they've abandoned this idea pretty much was because there was hidden cost of things like purchasing land, building stations, blasting through mountains, all of which pose and cost significant amounts, which would have to be overcome if you wanted a high-speed rail. But people talking about the benefits of it will most likely also talk about building a high-speed rail between LA and San Francisco, because that's kind of the next big project on the map. Additionally, something to be considered is that these high-speed rails have to be built over environmentally sensitive areas, which poses threats to different sorts of endangered species. There was a contention in this specific building about small fox species, and there was lots of protests, et cetera, about them. There's other unique problems and barriers to rails in the United States that you wouldn't think about with other countries. So first is the US has heavily invested in their airport infrastructure. So we don't have the airport insufficiencies like other countries have. And so as a result, these airline industries obviously are not lobbying for high-speed rails because that would be, dent their profit in airline industries. We also don't have the population densities and we're a larger plot of land, so our populations are more dispersed. So if you think about why the Northeast Corridor was so successful, it's because New York City, Boston, all of those kind of New England states are really, really close together and also have really dense populations. But that makes less sense if you expand it throughout, the vastness of the United States, right? You wouldn't want to build a high-speed rail going from like Utah to Texas. Nobody would take that. But it might make sense in smaller areas with more dispersed populations. But unfortunately, we don't have that as much in the US. We also don't have developed public transportation like other countries do. So let's say you take a high-speed rail from LA to San Francisco to LA. You would still need cars to go to drive around, get around the city, because our cities are not as walkable. So you would have to think about that. So for most people, it would make more sense to either drive there or fly there and rent a car. The other part is that there's lots of mountains through the US. And as Coach Sarah talked about, you have very specific topological, I don't know if that's a word, but you have very specific topography in which you have to build these high-speed rails. And the last one is funding. The future of them, for those of you who keep up with politics, is that Biden's infrastructure bill, which people have been talking about, which got pretty watered down, has passed, and it has had $0 for investment in high-speed rails. So that's pretty significant, and it's certainly means it's going to be a challenge to build this sort of infrastructure in the US.
So we just gave you a lot of information about how a lot of different countries deal with trains or don't deal with them in the case of the United States. But there's some other parts of this resolution and topic area that don't neatly fit into the little bubble of high-speed rails. And we want to clarify the differences between a couple types of high-speed trains that you will come across in your research. I'm going to introduce two of them. The first one is magnetic levitation trains, which we talked about in the definitions portions a little bit. This one, I believe, is topical ground for the affirmative to debate off of. I'll talk about why the other one isn't topical when we reveal it next. But let's talk about maglev trains. So what are maglev trains? Well, they are trains that use magnetic levitation technology to float on the track. They use magnets, repulsion, and attraction to shoot trains across a track that they float on top of. So there's very little resistance, which means they can go with much higher speeds down the track. So they end up being faster. They were developed by the Central Japan Railway Company, and Japan is currently working on implementing them themselves. The technology is good because it is a smooth ride, and it is also a very safe ride. And as I said, faster than others. I've seen a lot of research that people think that maglev trains are the future of high-speed rail. China has an operational maglev train that can run 268 to 311 miles per hour. That is much, much faster than other high-speed rails and blows our speed definitions out of the water. It is still half the speed of a commercial airline flight, but it would be much more efficient to get on a train and probably save you a little bit of time even still. Current tests of maglev trains, the most advanced ones, can even reach speeds of 375 miles an hour. And actually, the initial line, a maglev line by Japan that will be completed in 2027, is supposed to reach these top speeds. They're also going to extend this initial line down to Osaka, hopefully by 2045. And right now, you can actually go to Japan if you want to, and ride a test line of the magnetic levitation train. They have a little test ride. So if you happen to be in Japan and you're into trains, it might be something fun for you to do. China has also said that they plan to expand on their maglev line. So I think that this is topical because it meets the definition of what a train is. They're multi-car, they're on a track. I think that this is topical ground for us to debate. I think you could make a strong case for the United States should only build maglev trains. I think that if we're going to build new train lines anyways, they should be the greatest and the most high tech that we can. There's no use in building substandard high speed rail lines if we're going to be investing this much money. So I would highly suggest looking into those and utilizing those. But let's go to the next one that I don't suggest, and that's Hyperloop. Elon Musk, why have you betrayed us? So there's some problems with Hyperloop that I don't think makes it topical ground for us to debate on, and I know that hurts. But let's talk about why Hyperloop, what Hyperloop is, and why it's not topical ground for this. So Hyperloop is a high-speed transportation concept promoted by Elon Musk and all of his various companies, SpaceX and the Boring Company. And when I say boring, I don't mean it's boring and not fun. I mean boring as in like boring holes. They kind of promote this idea, and they're working hand in hand with the company Virgin to make this concept work. And essentially what Hyperloop is it uses the magnetic levitation system, so magnets floating, but in an airless tunnel that is completely sealed. And it mimics, in theory, the low pressure environment that you see at the high altitudes where planes fly. The purpose of this is to completely or nearly eliminate air resistance. So the trains can go as fast as they possibly can down the line. There is a couple implications of this. The first implication is that this means that these trains are going to be moving at such high speeds, well over 600 miles per hour. I think I even saw that theoretically they could go 1,000 miles per hour at the perfect conditions at the highest speeds. But that is extremely dangerous for people. And from what I understand, you will not be able to move in these kind of transportation pods. You will be strapped in, and you will experience quite a bit of G-force, which is a little terrifying. So right now there is a working model of this in Las Vegas. However, they've only gotten it up to, I think it was like 112 miles per hour as their like first live test demonstration. The CEO of Virgin took a ride in it, and while he was absolutely tickled about how it worked and how it went, it doesn't technically meet our definition for high speed, and it's just not a train. So these Hyperloop systems would have to be built completely underground in sealed tunnels, or if they were to be above ground, they would also have to be completely encased and enclosed in an airtight, vacuum sealed environment to get this airless tunnel effect. So we get into our topicality issue. Hyperloop is not a train with rails or a track. It's a series of pods and tubes. It's more like, you know, when your mom takes you to the bank or the pharmacy and you use the drive-through and they send the little container through the tube system and your mom pulls it out and puts her card inside, or you get the medicine from the tube and you send it back and it goes up through the tube, right? That's what this is. But that's not a train. And so I don't think that this is topical ground under the resolution. I don't think it meets the burden of what a train is. Obviously, if this is something you're really interested in debating about, you're more than welcome to research this and look into this as part of your case. Or maybe if you're on the negative, this is an alternative that you think that the United States should invest in. It's not a train, so it's topical neck ground. You can use the Hyperloop as your alternative suggestion that the United States should invest in. But I do not think that this meets the burden of the train, though it is a very fascinating piece of science and developing technology. Elon Musk is always good for the meme factor, but I don't think that it's worth most affirmatives' times to look into.
All right, thank you, Coach Sarah, for that. Now let's talk about how can we use all of this information and put it into contentions and what sorts of contentions you should be prepared for. So the pro contentions, as we talked about earlier, essential question is going to be economic growth. These are kind of three sectors of it. So the first one is creates jobs. There's an estimate going around out there that says for every $1 billion invested, 24,000 jobs are created. Whether or not that's worth it is, kind of a debatable issue. But what's to be said is that there's an additional jobs in high-speed rails that create jobs elsewhere. So places in like the manufacturing industry, the engineering, construction, et cetera. The second contention here is it stimulates economic growth. And it can do this in a few ways. First is that it's affordable because it returns to cities to open up the workforce outside of the city, right? So you could live a little bit further from the city and take the train into it. So that could stimulate economic development of like cities surrounding these high-speed rails. The other is that it creates jobs, which is always good for the economy. You can increase real estate investment, and that kind of goes along with the development of these small cities. And also some people can take, vacations throughout the US using these rails. So you have kind of an untapped tourist industry that might help stimulate that economic growth. The last one is poverty reduction, and that provides employment and access it provides employment to people without access to cars. And they can go into the city. So that also can be a big poverty reduction measure. It also gives access to affordable housing, because in cities it's more expensive to live, but outside of cities, right, you can afford to live further away from the cities where prices and real estate investments, et cetera, tend to be a little bit lower. And then also you have this more economic activity means that there are more taxes collected. So there's more funding for things like schools and social programs, all of which can help reduce that poverty reduction. The last thing I wanted to say back on the economic growth is that federal government investment signals to the market that this is an area that's going to continue to grow. And so as a result, private investors will put money into this area, right? So that's kind of how the cycle of the economic growth especially will be happening with the high-speed rails. Then you have these contentions about climate change and oil dependence. So the climate change, what the pro wants to be saying is that there's going to be less CO2 produced from things like driving and flying. You could also do shipments by high-speed rails, remember, which are electrified. You could also say that it helps free up traffic congestion, and traffic congestion really magnifies the amount of CO2 being produced, right? Because you have all these cars that are just sitting in traffic. So since high-speed rails are electrified, electricity could be produced with different types of energy. Status quo, it's probably coal, but you could make an argument that we could shift to things like renewable energy, use nuclear energy, et cetera, which could help you combat some of these, like, you produce more, or you use coal, you produce more CO2, things like that. You could also make an argument that there's reduced land use, which is always good for climate, because high-speed rails, even though they would use land, would save land based on not having to build these big highways and all of these other like roads and streets, et cetera. The other debate here is going to be oil dependence. So vehicles use oils, high-speed rails use electricity. So you could say that this reduces our dependence on oil, which is always good. And also you could talk about traffic congestion here again. Another one, I don't think this is going to be super viable, but you could say reduce car accidents. People get into more car accidents per year based on traffic congestion. So you might run into a contention that's talking about that. I don't know if you're going to win that like quantification and the magnitude version of the impact, but you might, get some pushback with probability there. One thing that I didn't add here is China competition. There might be an advantage about great power competition with China. And I'm not exactly sure what it would say without looking at a contention, but it would say something along the lines that China is rapidly expanding the BRI initiatives, which Coach Sarah talked about, especially into other countries. So you could say that they're making a grab for power, which is what BRI essentially is. So this would shift geopolitics into a China rise, which is bad for, insert generic reason, China rise bad. And the only way that the US can counter this is by competing in this sector, which includes high-speed rails. So that might be kind of a contention that people say. One last note on the pro. I think a big advantage that the pro has is that there's a lot of sources that have quantification. So quantification in this topic favors the pro. And there's a lot of specific statistics you can use here, like the $1 billion equals 24,000 jobs, things like that, or how much money it would cost, how much money it would save. All of those authors are writing about these things. And whenever you can give concrete numbers to judges, it makes a lot more sense and you can debate things at the magnitude level. Okay, let's switch over. Sarah, do you have anything to add to the pro, or do we want to switch over to the con?
No, I think that you did a really good job.
Okay, we'll switch over to the con here. Okay, so a couple arguments here. The first biggest one, which I think everyone should be including, is national debt. And the reason that you should include it is not only because it's probably true, but because it's a good turn to any economic advantage impacts. So a lot of the pro is going to be reading these econ advantages. You want to have something to say, and you ideally want to start developing those answers earlier on in the debate, so in those constructive speeches. So the high-speed rail is very expensive to build. High-speed rail's estimates are between $1 trillion to upwards of $4 trillion. In order for it to have a significant impact, it has to lead to widespread usage in the US for significant investment. So this is kind of a double bind argument that you can put the pro in. So if they try to get out of this argument and say it's not going to cost that much, then the high-speed rail is not going to be significant enough for them to access their impacts. It won't do anything for the economy. It won't do anything for oil dependence if it's a small rail. So they kind of have to be leaning into, it's going to be a massive rail, it's going to have massive impacts. And that's where you get all of your links for, that's true, here's why it's going to be a national debt issue. I think that you can say national debt is, you have a greater annual deficit and loans. And as a result, that high debt increases borrowing costs for everyone, which could hinder kind of investment, private investments, things like that. There are two likely ways that they're going to say that they're going to fund this high-speed rail. The first is to borrow additional money, and the second is to raise taxes. And so both of those you could use to push back against saying, any economic advantage impacts. And one thing, if you weren't familiar with debt, I'll kind of explain what it is. So debt is the money that the US takes in relative to its expenses. So if the US spends $2 trillion, but only takes in $1 trillion, that's a deficit of $1 trillion, right? And so this is bad because it increases borrowing costs for everyone, right? Banks are happy to lend money to the federal government for this. And as a result, there's less money to lend to consumers, so that increases the borrowing cost to consumers, which is kind of how you get some of these higher interest rates and all of those things is an additional reason that debt is bad. The second reason is political opposition. So any kind of, these are more policy debate arguments, but they've been making their way into public forum. And it's just like things like Biden's agenda or undermining state and local politicians, people would say. Some people will say that it could impact the midterm elections. So right now in the Senate, it's 50-50 with Vice President Democrat breaking the tie on legislation. Passing this could tip the scale in one favor or another. So it could impact midterms, which you might hear the arguments. The other one that you should be saying in general, and these can be some of your refutations, is that it's just a bad form of transportation for all of the reasons that it doesn't work in the US, right? The population is too dispersed. We already have strong air networks and roads. You could make a contention about air networks and it hurting the airline industry. Roads will still exist and not be used. Electricity produced by coal and CO2 air pollution is bad. You have to import a lot of the materials to build it, which hurts the US economy to the benefit of other states. Fewer people will use it anyways because they're more accustomed to automobiles, right? So all of these reasons are just reasons that high-speed rails might be a bad form of transportation for the United States. The last two kind of con contentions is first environmental. So lines are built over environmentally sensitive areas. So there could definitely be some arguments about, like hurting biodiversity, things like that. You could have increased CO2 in the short term, right? Putting in the rail track, elevated systems produced, the CO2 produced to mine materials to make the trains, cars, so that there's great evidence that this is going to massively increase our carbon dioxide output, especially in the short term. The last one you could say, it's not really environmental, but it is a contention area, is that the lines are more likely to be built over poorer communities. And because of this, it's because people will have less political influence to reject the rail systems. So that could be something that you're thinking about when you're making the contentions. The last form of debate, and this is kind of your second level answers, and I think more advanced debaters, debaters with more experience will be making this argument, is HSR is electrified. So the affirmative can't really say that coal is the optimal form of electricity. So they're going to have to shift the debate to something like renewable energy is going to be used, which is a strategic thing for the affirmative. What you could do is counter this and say that renewable energy is actually bad, because in order to produce it, you have to mine rare earth metals. So they're bad because a lot of environmentally damage in areas that are mines. And we don't do this in US, really mining rare earth metals. So that would increase US dependence on other countries, especially China. And then you could say if it doesn't use renewable energy, then it's more likely to use CO2, SO2, or nuclear energy, et cetera. And the last contention you could make is brain drain in rural areas. So kind of some of the affirmative impacts were like people can work further and then just transport into the city. That could also be bad because you're taking those people who are more likely to get city jobs and moving them away from rural areas. So I think the neg trick here is really just saying, last thing I'll say is that you have to build a massive amount of rail for it to solve anything. And so it's really costly. You're spending trillions of dollars, and you have to accelerate inflation dramatically, which hurts the economy, has negative impacts, et cetera, or it is very large environmental impacts. Yeah, and that's the section on the pro and con contention. Sarah, unless I missed anything, I think we can wrap it up.
I think so. Thank you.
All right, thank y'all, everyone. And if you have any questions, feel free to let your coaches know and they should be able to help you. All right, take care.